Have you ever wondered what you would do if you could start life over, leave responsibilities behind and live your own dreams? In The Life I Never Lived, dive into the touching journey of Susan, a 45-year-old woman who, after raising her children and seeing them leave home, faces the emptiness of a silent house and a profound sense of loss. In this poignant tale, Susan finds herself suddenly alone, surrounded by memories and the remnants of a life dedicated to family. As she organizes old photo albums and forgotten journals, she rediscovers passions and dreams she had set aside for her family responsibilities. With renewed courage, she takes her first step towards a new chapter in her life, confronting fears, past traumas, and ultimately embracing the possibility of a fresh start. Subscribe to our channel, like, comment, and share our videos to stay updated with our content and help YouTube spread these and other inspiring stories to even more people. Susan closed her son's bedroom door for the last time that morning. The bed was neatly made, the closet empty, and the sense of absence was palpable. She took a deep breath, trying to absorb the moment, but the sound of the door closing echoed through the house, reminding her of the new reality she now faced. Her youngest son, Nathan, had just left for college, and for the first time in decades, Susan was completely alone. The house, once vibrant with the sounds of laughter, arguments, and ceaseless activity, now felt like a silent desert. Every room told a story of years gone by, of scattered toys, laundry piles, and schoolwork spread across the kitchen table. Now everything was perfectly organized, but the order brought no peace, only a sense of emptiness. Susan sat at the kitchen table, where so many meals had been shared, where so much motherly advice had been given, and felt a lump tighten in her throat. The coffee cup in her hands was cooling slowly, reflecting the pace at which the warmth of daily life seemed to be slipping from her days. She looked at the cup, noticing for the first time in a long time the small details. The worn edge, a small crack on the handle, as if her own life was there, marked by time, choices, and sacrifices. She had always known this moment would come, but she never imagined it would be so hard. She had spent the last 25 years dedicated to raising her children, supporting her husband's career, and being the foundation that held the family together. Now, with the children grown and her husband busy with his own interests, Susan faced the question she had always feared answering. What now? Susan got up from the table and walked through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She passed by Nathan's room, her older daughter Jessica's room, who had also moved out years before, and finally arrived at her own bedroom. The large bed, with perfectly stretched sheets, seemed too big for one person. She sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of loneliness press on her chest. The walls of the room were adorned with family photos, moments frozen in time, full of smiles and happiness that now seemed so distant. Susan picked up one of the photos, an image from when the children were young, all together on a beach trip. She remembered how at that time life seemed so full of purpose, so rich with small moments of joy and chaos. But now, looking at those images, everything seemed like a past life, a life that no longer belonged to her. It was as if all these years she had lived for others, putting her own desires and dreams on a high shelf out of reach, while dedicating her time and energy to ensuring that everyone around her was happy and fulfilled. Susan realized, with a sharp pain in her chest, that she had never allowed herself to ask what she truly wanted from life. She had never given herself time to dream, to think of herself as a woman with her own desires, outside of the role of mother and wife. She placed the photo back and walked to the window. Outside, the autumn leaves were slowly falling, covering the garden she had tended with such care. The vibrant colors of the leaves contrasted with the gray feeling that lingered inside her. Susan had always loved autumn, but now even the colors of the season seemed tinged with a melancholy she couldn't shake. As she watched the leaves dance in the wind, Susan felt the tears begin to roll down her face. They weren't tears of deep sadness but of a silent ache, the realization that she had lost something over the years. She had always known that being a mother meant giving up certain things, but she had never realized how much she had lost of herself in the process. Feeling overwhelmed by these emotions, Susan lay down on the bed, curling up in a fetal position as if she could protect herself from the avalanche of feelings crashing over her. She cried, not only for the absence of her children but for all the dreams she had never lived, for all the times she had forgotten herself, for all the moments she had let slip by without living fully. In the silence of the empty house, Susan began to realize that this could be a new beginning, but she also knew the road would be long and difficult. For the first time she was alone with herself, without distractions, without immediate commitments. It was just her and her thoughts, and the daunting freedom of finally having to figure out what to do with her own life. The tears stopped, but the weight in her chest remained. Susan knew that something needed to change, but she had no idea where to start. She slowly got out of bed, feeling heavy, and walked to the bedroom mirror. She looked at herself, at the face marked by time, at the eyes that no longer sparkled as they once did. And it was at that moment that she realized that, although she didn't yet know which path to take, she knew she needed to start somewhere. The emptiness of the silent house was indeed terrifying. But perhaps, Susan thought, this emptiness could be filled with something new, something she didn't yet know but was waiting to be discovered. Susan woke up that morning with a different sensation. It was still early and the house, as always, was silent. The timid autumn sun streamed into her room through the gaps in the curtains, casting soft light patterns on the old furniture. She lay still for a few minutes, feeling the cool breeze coming through the slightly open window, but something inside her pulsed, a gentle discomfort, as if something was about to change. After getting up and going through her morning routine, Susan found herself drawn to the attic of the house, a space she hadn't visited in years. She wasn't sure why, but she felt a compelling need to be there. The attic was a place of memories where old, forgotten objects were stored away. She carefully walked up the narrow stairs, each step creaking under her weight. At the top, she pulled the chain to turn on the light. The space was dusty, and the air carried the unmistakable smell of things that had been stored for too long. Susan began to explore the stacked boxes, slowly moving objects that held pieces of her history. Old photographs, travel souvenirs, children's toys. Each item brought a rush of memories, but that wasn't what she was looking for. She continued sifting through the boxes until at the bottom of one she found something that made her heart race. A set of hardcover notebooks, their pages yellowed with age. She recognized the journals immediately. They were hers, written during her youth. Carefully, she sat on the floor and began to flip through the pages, diving into the words she had penned so many years ago. The emotions surfaced almost overwhelmingly. Each entry was a reflection of her thoughts, dreams, and hopes for a future that seemed so distant at the time. She wrote about her passion for painting, something she had started as a teenager but abandoned when life became too busy. She wrote about the stories she wanted to tell, the books she dreamed of writing. And above all, she wrote about the desire to explore the world, to travel to exotic places, to experience life in ways she had never had the chance to. As she read, Susan felt a tightening in her chest. Those dreams, which seemed so vivid in the pages of the journals, now felt distant, as if they belonged to someone else. She remembered how, over the years, she had set aside each of those passions, replacing them with responsibilities that, though important, had slowly smothered the fire that once burned within her. She got up and began to organize the journals into a small pile, determined to bring those fragments of her past downstairs. But before she went down, something caught her eye. In the corner of the attic, covered by a sheet, was an old painting canvas. Susan walked over and, with trembling hands, removed the sheet, revealing an unfinished painting she had started many years before. It was a landscape with green hills and a bright blue sky, but the canvas was only partially complete. The colors were still vibrant, but what struck Susan the most was the sense of familiarity, as if part of her had been stored on that canvas all these years. She traced her fingers over the surface of the canvas, recalling how she felt when painting, how time seemed to stand still when she was immersed in her art. But at the same time, fear enveloped her. Fear of having lost the skill, fear that it might be too late to revive those passions. Susan descended from the attic, carrying the journals and the painting. She placed the journals on the kitchen table and leaned the painting against the wall, in a spot where she could see it whenever she passed by. Throughout the rest of the day she remained pensive, unable to focus on anything. The memories of her dreams haunted her, and the idea of having abandoned something so important began to weigh heavily on her heart. By evening, Susan decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. She needed fresh air, a change of scenery, and perhaps some clarity about what she was feeling. She walked through the quiet streets, observing the trees beginning to shed their leaves, the houses decorated for autumn. Each step was a reflection of her own internal journey, a search for something she couldn't quite define. Then, as she turned a corner, Susan came across a friend she hadn't seen in years. Elaine, an old college buddy, was standing in front of a small cafe, with a smile on her face upon seeing her. The two embraced, surprised and delighted by the unexpected reunion. "You here, Susan? It's been ages," Elaine said enthusiastically. "Let's grab a coffee and catch up?" Susan, eager for a distraction, accepted the invitation. They entered the cozy cafe, sat near the window and soon began reminiscing about old times. Elaine seemed different, but in a good way. There was an energy, a liveliness in her that Susan didn't remember seeing before. As they talked, Susan learned that Elaine, after many years working at an unsatisfying job, had decided to leave it all behind and pursue her dreams. She had opened a small art gallery in town, where she also taught painting classes to women in the community. The passion in Elaine's eyes was undeniable as she spoke about her work, and Susan felt a pang of envy mixed with admiration. "It was tough at first," Elaine admitted, "but it was the best decision I ever made. I was so stuck living a routine that didn't bring me happiness. Now I feel like I'm truly living." Elaine's words resonated with Susan. Throughout the rest of their conversation she grew quieter, reflecting on what she had heard. It was as if Elaine was the embodiment of everything Susan had abandoned. At the same time, the fear of failure, of not being able to reclaim lost time, kept her silent. When they said goodbye, Elaine extended an invitation for Susan to visit the gallery. "Come see me sometime," she said. "I'd love to show you what I've been working on. And who knows, maybe you'll even pick up the brushes again." Susan thanked her and tucked the invitation into her bag. On her way home her mind was racing. The meeting with Elaine had been an unexpected catalyst, rekindling the flames of dreams Susan had tried to ignore. For the first time in a long while she began to wonder if there was still time for her, if she could still recover part of the woman she once was. Back home, Susan sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by the journals and the unfinished painting. A mix of emotions swirled within her: fear, hope, regret, and a small but growing sense of excitement. Elaine's invitation was there, like a promise of something new, something she had long abandoned. That night, Susan decided that even if it was just a small step, she needed to do something. She needed to break free from the inertia that had held her for so long. And maybe, just maybe, it was possible to revive those dreams that had remained dormant for so many years. She knew the journey would be long and full of challenges, but something within her was beginning to change. For the first time in years, Susan felt a spark of hope, a desire to rediscover who she truly was. And as she looked at the unfinished painting, she decided that the next day she would visit Elaine. It was time to start living the life she had never had the courage to live before. The next morning, Susan woke up with her heart racing faster than usual. She had made a decision that seemed small but felt like a leap into the unknown. Over the years, Susan had grown accustomed to routine, to the predictability of her life. There was comfort in knowing exactly what to expect each day, even if it meant suppressing her own desires. But today would be different. She got up and went to the bathroom mirror, examining her reflection. The lines on her face and the gray strands in her hair were evidence of the time that had passed. What she saw there was a woman marked by years of dedication to her family, but also someone who, for the first time in a long while, was determined to do something for herself. After a light breakfast, Susan grabbed her coat and left the house. She walked toward the city center, feeling the crisp autumn breeze. The sound of crunching leaves echoed with each step, a fitting soundtrack for the introspective moment she was in. In her hands she carried the flyer Elaine had given her the day before, an invitation to the gallery and a recommendation for an art school offering painting classes. Arriving at the building, Susan paused for a moment, hesitating. The facade was modest, with a small sign indicating the entrance to the art school. She looked around as if searching for an excuse to go back home, but found none. She knew that if she turned back now, she might never have the courage to take that step again. Taking a deep breath, she entered. The inside of the building was cozy, with walls decorated by paintings from students and local artists. The smell of paint and drawing paper filled the air, bringing back memories of Susan's youth when she would spend hours in her room painting and drawing in silence. She was greeted by a middle-aged woman with a warm smile. "Good morning. How can I help you?" the receptionist asked. Susan hesitated for a moment but finally found her words. "I'd like to enroll in the painting classes," she said, trying to sound confident. "Sure. We have classes for all levels, from beginners to more advanced. May I ask what your experience with painting is?" the woman asked while retrieving some forms. "Well, I used to paint when I was younger, but it's been a long time since I last did, Susan admitted, feeling a lump forming in her throat. I understand, the woman said with empathy in her voice. Well, you're in the right place. The classes are relaxed and everyone here is at different stages of learning. I think you'll feel comfortable. Susan filled out the forms and within minutes she was officially enrolled. The first class would be that very afternoon. Her heart raced again, this time with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was real now. There was no turning back. That afternoon, Susan returned to the art school, this time with a bag containing brushes and paint tubes she had bought long ago but never used. As she waited in the hallway, other people began to arrive, all carrying similar materials. She noticed that most of the students seemed to be at a similar stage in life. Many had gray hair like her and expressions suggesting they were there in search of something more. The classroom door opened, revealing a tall, slender woman with curly hair and a welcoming smile. Welcome everyone, she said. My name is Margaret and I'll be your instructor. I hope you're ready to explore your creativity and above all have fun. Susan entered the room with the other students and chose a spot near a window, where natural light flooded the space. In front of her was a blank canvas and a palette of colors. The environment was calm with soft classical music playing in the background. Today we're going to start with something simple, Margaret said as she handed each student a photo of a landscape to use as reference. Remember, this isn't a test. There are no mistakes here, only learning opportunities. The important thing is to express yourselves freely. Susan looked at the blank canvas in front of her and felt a flutter of nerves. It was as if all her fears and insecurities had resurfaced at that moment. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she couldn't produce anything worthwhile? These thoughts haunted her, almost paralyzing her. But then she remembered Elaine's words from the night before. It was the best decision I've ever made. Susan knew that if she didn't try, she would never know what she was capable of. With slightly trembling hands, she picked up the brush and began mixing colors on the palette. The first stroke was the hardest, but once the brush touched the canvas, something inside her began to relax. As she painted, the world around her seemed to disappear. Susan was lost in the moment, focused only on the colors and shapes emerging on the canvas. With each new brushstroke, she felt a mix of fear and joy. Fear of exposing herself in such a vulnerable way, but also an indescribable joy at finally doing something she loved. The other students around her were also immersed in their own creations, and Susan realized she was not alone on this journey. Everyone there, in some way, was seeking a second chance, trying to revive something they had lost along the way. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a mutual understanding that transcended words. Margaret walked behind Susan and observed the painting beginning to take shape on the canvas. "This is beautiful, Susan," she said with an encouraging smile. "You have a steady hand and a great sense of color. Keep it up." The compliment warmed Susan's heart, easing some of the insecurity she felt. She continued painting, allowing herself to be guided by her intuition, without worrying about the final result. For the first time in years, she felt free, as if she were finally making room for her own desires to blossom. When the class ended, Susan got up from her seat and stepped back to admire her work. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was something in those awkward brushstrokes that filled her with immense pride. It was the first step of a long journey, and despite all her fears, Susan was ready to follow it. As she left the classroom, Margaret approached her again. "Susan, I really hope you continue coming to the classes. I see great potential in you and I believe that, with time, you could create amazing things." Susan smiled, thanking her for the kind words. As she walked back home, she felt a wave of emotion wash over her. The fear was still there, but now it was accompanied by a sense of accomplishment, of purpose. She knew the journey wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, doubts, and days when fear might return to overwhelm her. But for the first time in a long time, Susan was willing to face it all. She was determined to live the life she had always dreamed of, a life where her own desires and passions had a prominent place. And so, with her heart full of new hopes, Susan continued to take her first steps toward a life she could finally call her own. The following days were a blend of new experiences and deep reflections for Susan. Each brushstroke on the canvas, each painting class she attended, was a step toward rediscovering herself. But with this journey came the ghosts of the past, memories and regrets she had buried so deeply that she had almost forgotten they existed. One afternoon, while sorting through some old papers in her home, Susan discovered a dusty box at the bottom of a closet. It was a memory box filled with letters, photos, and small keepsakes she had collected over the years. Opening the box, she was overwhelmed by a whirlwind of emotions. The first thing she saw was a photo of herself with her ex-boyfriend, Michael. The image showed them young, smiling, and in love, holding hands on a trip they had taken together years ago. She sat down on the floor, holding the photo carefully. Michael had been her first great love, and the decision to end the relationship was one of the hardest she had ever made. At the time, Susan felt she needed to prioritize her family and career, setting aside her own dreams. Michael was a free spirit, always wanting to explore the world and follow his own dreams, something she admired deeply but that also frightened her. They went their separate ways, and Susan never saw him again, though her thoughts often drifted back to him in moments of silence. The memories of Michael brought up other regrets Susan had been carrying silently. There were the moments she chose the safe path, when she conformed to others' expectations instead of following her own heart. She thought about the opportunities she missed, like studying art at a prestigious university or traveling the world before settling down. The life she lived was full of love and devotion to her family, but now with the house empty, those what-ifs haunted her. As she rummaged through the box, she found a letter she had never sent. It was a letter to Michael written shortly after their breakup, but for some reason she never had the courage to send it. The letter was filled with unspoken feelings, repressed desires, and regrets about letting the relationship end without fighting for it. Susan read the letter, feeling a lump in her throat. Tears streamed down her face as she finally allowed herself to confront the feelings she had buried for so long. With each sentence she read, she felt a mix of pain and relief. Pain for what could have been, and relief for finally acknowledging these parts of herself. It was as if she was opening an old wound that had never healed properly but needed to be addressed so it could finally mend. That night, Susan couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, tossing and turning, tormented by the memories and regrets flooding her mind. She decided that if she wanted to move forward, she needed to confront these ghosts of the past actively, not just let them haunt her in silence. She needed to forgive herself for her choices and, perhaps, find a way to make peace with the decisions she had made. In the following days, Susan began to explore ways to deal with these feelings. She talked with Elaine, her longtime friend who had encouraged her to follow her own path. Elaine, ever wise, listened attentively and encouraged Susan to reach out to Michael if it would help lighten the burden she carried. "Sometimes, we need to close a chapter for real before we can start another," Elaine said with her characteristic calm. Inspired by this conversation, Susan made a courageous decision. She resolved to seek out Michael, not to rekindle a romance but to give herself the chance to say what she had never said, to find closure for that chapter of her life. She found Michael's contact through a careful search on social media. She discovered he was living in California, working as a photographer and still traveling the world as he had always dreamed. He seemed happy, fulfilled, and this brought a bittersweet feeling to Susan. What might have happened if she had allowed herself to follow that path with him? After days of mentally preparing herself, Susan finally typed a short but sincere message. "Hello, Michael. This is Susan. It's been many years, but lately I've been thinking a lot about you and what happened between us. I'd like to talk if you're willing." Michael's response came faster than she expected. He was surprised but also curious to know how she was. They scheduled a call for the following weekend, which left Susan both anxious and relieved. It was the beginning of a process she knew she needed to face in order to finally move forward. As she awaited the day of the call, Susan continued with her painting classes. Each session was an opportunity to express the complex feelings that tormented her. One of her paintings, a seascape in shades of gray and blue, perfectly reflected the turmoil of emotions she was experiencing. Margaret, her instructor, noticed the intensity of the work and in one of the classes commented, "You're putting a lot of soul into your paintings, Susan. It's like you're letting everything out." Susan simply smiled, recognizing that painting was becoming a kind of therapy for her. It was her way of processing everything that was happening, of dealing with the feelings that had been suppressed for so long. Finally, the day of the call arrived. Susan sat in the living room, her hands trembling, waiting for Michael's call. When the phone rang, she took a deep breath and answered. Michael's voice, now more mature and calm, brought a flood of memories. They talked at length, reminiscing about the times they spent together, but also sharing what had happened in their lives since then. Susan finally had the chance to tell Michael what she had never said. that she had always admired him and that, although she had chosen a different path, her affection for him never disappeared. Michael, in turn, shared how he had been sad about the breakup but understood her reasons. He was happy that Susan was finally pursuing her own dreams and encouraged her to continue on this journey. When the call ended, Susan felt a lightness she hadn't felt in years. It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from her shoulders. There were no more ghosts haunting her, just the certainty that, although the past could not be changed, the future was still full of possibilities. Susan knew that from that moment on she was more ready than ever to move forward, no longer shackled by past choices but free to live fully the years that lay ahead. The morning sun gently illuminated Susan's living room, casting a golden light over the bookshelves brimming with volumes and the paintings she proudly displayed on the walls. The house, once an echo of the past, now vibrated with a new energy. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the air, and the table was covered with maps and travel guides. Susan, with a serene smile on her lips, was studying the pages of a European travel guide, her eyes shining with anticipation and excitement. Months had passed since Susan took the first step on her journey of self-discovery. With each painting class, each conversation with Michael, and each internal reflection, she had been rebuilding herself, piece by piece. The fear and inertia that once paralyzed her had been replaced by a quiet but powerful courage. For the first time in decades, Susan felt connected with the woman she was inside, the woman who had been forgotten amid the responsibilities and sacrifices of family life. Now, with the certainty that her life was just beginning, Susan decided to fulfill an old dream that had always been dormant: to travel the world, explore new horizons, and above all, experience the freedom that came with a fresh start. She had always wanted to see the lights of the Eiffel Tower at night, walk the historic streets of Rome, lose herself in the colorful markets of Marrakesh, and feel the Mediterranean breeze while sailing through the Greek islands. These dreams, which once seemed so distant, were now within her reach. And this time, nothing would stop her from making them a reality. Susan spent weeks planning her dream trip, consulting maps and travel websites, booking hotels and flights, and carefully choosing the destinations that appealed to her the most. She decided to start in Paris, the city of love and art, where she could immerse herself in museums, cafes, and small galleries that would feed her new passion for painting. From there, she would head to Italy, where she planned to enroll in an artistic retreat in Tuscany, an experience that perfectly combined her love for art and nature. But more than the places she would visit, what truly mattered to Susan was the internal journey this trip represented. Each new destination would be a metaphor for the new chapters of her life, each new experience a reminder that she still had much to live, much to discover, and many dreams to achieve. Before leaving, Susan decided to organize a symbolic farewell. She invited her children, close friends, and even some new friends she had made in painting classes to a dinner at her home. It was a way to celebrate not only the trip but also the new woman she had become. That evening, the house was filled with laughter, conversation, and the soft sound of background music. Susan's children looked at her with admiration and surprise, proud to see their mother so full of life and enthusiasm. They had always known she was strong, but they had never seen her so happy, so at peace with herself. For them, this new phase of Susan's life was an inspiration, a living proof that it is never too late to follow one's dreams. After dinner, Susan gave a brief speech, something she had never done before but felt was necessary. With a firm but emotional voice, she shared her reflections on the past few months. For many years I lived for others and I have no regrets about any of those moments. I love my children and the life we built together. But now I understand that I also need to live for myself. No matter how old we are, there is always time to start anew, to discover who we really are and what we want from life. And I am ready for this new adventure. Susan's words were met with applause and heartfelt hugs. Everyone there knew that this was not just the beginning of a physical journey but the start of a much deeper and more meaningful journey. The next day, with her suitcase packed and her heart light, Susan took one last walk around her garden. She looked at the flowers beginning to bloom, reflecting the approaching spring, and felt that, in a way, she too was blooming, evolving into a new version of herself. When the taxi arrived, Susan got in with a confident smile. As the car drove away, she looked out the window and saw her house receding, but this time there was no sadness, only a sweet anticipation of what was to come. She knew she was leaving one chapter behind, but at the same time she was starting the most exciting one of all. Hours later, as the plane took off, Susan looked out the window at the clouds and felt a deep peace. She didn't know exactly what the future held for her, but for the first time in a long while it didn't scare her. On the contrary, the uncertainty was part of the beauty of a fresh start. She was ready to embrace every moment, every new experience, with an open heart and a curious mind. When the plane finally landed in Paris, Susan felt a wave of emotion. As she stepped onto French soil, she took a deep breath, savoring the fresh air of the new city, and smiled. There, in that foreign land, she felt more at home with herself than she ever had before. With her suitcase in hand and a map in her bag, Susan began to walk the streets of Paris, exploring every corner with the enthusiasm of a young woman discovering the world for the first time. The city, with its twinkling lights and undeniable charm, seemed to welcome her with open arms. And so, with her heart full of dreams and her eyes set on the horizon, Susan began to live the life she had never lived. The fresh start she had longed for was finally in her hands, and she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. The past was left behind, and before her lay a bright future, full of possibilities and adventures. After all, it is never too late to follow your dreams and live fully.